How's it going, my Guild Wars gamers? In this video I'm going to go over the Power Herald build for World vs. World. This class can do large spike damage as well as some great sustain damage. It also has some great group utility with boon applications and damage reduction. I'm just going to start off and go over the build, as I'm running Devastation, Invocation, and Herald. In Devastation we have exposed defenses, so your first attack when entering combat applies 5 stacks of vulnerability. As you see, I have it on my bar right now. Unsuspecting strikes, so deal 10% increased damage to foes with 80% health and above. Destructive impulses, so deal 5% damage increase per weapon that you're holding. So if you're doing math right, it's 5 for hammer and then 10 for your swords. Moving on to Assassin's Presence, so grant you and your allies 150 ferocity while you're in combat. So with a herald in every party, the entire raid should have this on their bar. If you're in a situation where you have more than one herald in your party, one of you can take Notoriety. So might grants you more power, and you gain might when you're using a stance skill, so your utility skills here. Targeted Destruction, deal increased damage to foes based off their vulnerability stacks. So basically this just increases the effectiveness of vulnerability by 50%. And lastly, you can take Swift Termination, which gives you 20% damage increase against foes with 50% health or less. Or if you want to bring more group utility, you can take Brutality. So the way this works is for each second that you have quickness, you will remove 1 stack of stability per target that you hit. A great skill to use this with is Vengeful Hammers, since it has no cap and it is also unblockable. Moving on to Invocation, Invoker's Rage, so gain Fury when you invoke a legend. Rising Tide, so you have a 7% damage increase while you have a health threshold of 90% and above. Ferocious Aggression, so all damage dealt is increased by 7% while you have Fury. That's 2 7% damage increases in a row. Incense Response, so gain might when you grant yourself Fury. Contain Temper, gain Fury when you disable a foe. So in the Herald's case, it would be a knockback, a knockdown, or a taunt. Roiling Miss, this is probably the most important trait in this entire build. So crit hit chance has increased effectiveness when you're under the effect of Fury. So usually Fury gives you 20% crit chance. With this trait, it gives you 40% crit chance. And lastly, of course, the Herald. So the Herald grants you your F2 skill. So depending on which stance you're in, it'll apply a specific passive to you and your allies. So while I'm in Dragon stance here, it grants me and my allies bonus boon duration. And then the active of it, if you press it again, it does the exact same just for an extra 2 seconds. And your F2 and Dwarf stance is reduce incoming damage to allies by 10%, and the active is grant you and your allies 2 stacks of stability. Rising Momentum, gain increased movement speed for each point of upkeep in use. So these arrows here are the indicators for the upkeep skill. So for example, in Dwarf stance, Vengeful Hammers is an upkeep skill. So when I activate it, these arrows go all the way down, which means I'm losing energy right here. So the best way to play this build is to maintain this energy as much as possible, which means switching in between stances a lot. Next, there's Draconic Fortitude, so just a 10% health increase. Then we have Shared Empowerment. We're applying a boon to an ally, also apply might to nearby allies. So this works with the other facets that you apply. As you see, I'm not running my might facet, but I'm still getting it here from this trait. Reinforce Potency, you also gain 1% damage increase per boon that you have. So right now I have 4 different boons, I have 4% damage increase from this alone. And there's Forceful Persistence, deal increased strike damage with active upkeep skills. So the more upkeep skills you have going, so meaning the less arrows that are going right, the more damage you are doing. So if I put a 4th facet going, it would be 12% damage because it's 3% on the Herald skills. And you could go for as far as 5 because your F2 counts, so you can have up to a 15% damage increase while in Dragon stance. But just beware that you're losing energy fast when you have these going. The 13% damage that it says is in regards to Dwarf stance when you use Vengeful Hammers. Or you can take Draconic Echo. You retain your facet passives for a duration after using their consume abilities. As you see, I will use Elemental Blast here, which is facet elements consume, and after using it I'm still generating swiftness for a few seconds. So I usually have facet of light, facet of darkness, and facet of elements going. That way, when we're just poking and doing small range bombs, I'm still gaining energy here. So I can stay in Dragon as long as I can before we go into like a melee bomb, or if we're having a heavy encounter. Once we're about to engage on the enemy, I will pop the 4th facet to grant might to me and my allies, and as well it will grant me more damage from forceful persistence. So next I'm just going to go over the gear, the equipment. So I'm running full Berserker gear with Rune of the Scholar, with power infusions as well. And for my weapons is Berserker swords, of course, with Sigil of Energy and Sigil of Bloodlust, and a Berserker hammer with Sigil of Impact and Sigil of Hydromancy. And for my trinkets, I'm running all Berserker as well, and I have 1 Marauder ring to put me over that 18k health. And the reason why I take Hydromancy on my hammer is because it works when you switch stances, and I've kind of worked it into my rotation to switch stances whenever I face smash. And since it does crit, I've seen it hit like an extra 4,000 damage onto that face smash. And it also shares the same cooldown as switching stances as well, which is 9 seconds. And Sigil of Energy works the same way. So if you're in sword and you need a dodge, you can just switch stances. So the best way to do damage with this class is to try to upkeep Fury as much as possible, as well as keep in mind your upkeep skills. Like I mentioned, the more of these you have going, the more damage you're going to be doing. And I'll say this again as well, switch stances as much as possible to maintain the ability to drain energy and do more damage. There will be moments where you do want to camp in Dwarf, for sure, just for stability or the damage reduction. Majority of early fights, you will be in Dragon stance, applying these boons to your allies. The next thing I'll go over are the weapon skills as well as the stance skills. I'll start off with the weapon ones. Hammer 1, Hammer Bolt, your auto attack. So it actually pierces targets. So it hits up to 5 players, so it can end up doing a ton of damage. Next is Hammer 2, Coalescence of Ruin. Use this as many times as you can in a fight. It's only an 8-second cooldown, so you can use it multiple times. Just be aware of the windup that it has, so if you're using it on a moving group, try to lead your shot. Hammer 3, Face Smash. So this thing hits like a truck. You're going to want to use this as many times as possible as well. However, just be cautious when you do use it, because you get locked in place when you cast it. As you see, I can't move at all when I'm in the air like that. This skill is great to use with other heralds, specifically on Mesmer poles. If you get the timing right, you can get a bunch of downs with it. A lot of the time you can actually combo COR and Face Smash together, like this. Next we have Feel the Miss, which is just a projectile block. And lastly, Hammer 5, Drop the Hammer, which you want to use when blasting for stealth, and it's also a knockdown as well. Just a little side note, when you're blasting for stealth while you're out of combat, what you can do is Hammer 5 and then switch to his staff in your inventory, use Staff 4, and then switch back to Hammer. Instead of having to use Face Smash, if you wanted to use a double blast, you can save this for damage instead. Now I'll go over the sword skills. So Sword 1, your auto attack applies vulnerability, and the last part does a little 2-part damage. Like that. Next, Sword 2, Chilling Isolation, has 2-part damage, also applies chilled. Sword 3, Unrelenting Assault. I would try to avoid using this skill in the middle of a fight. You always return to the first target hit, however, you don't know where that first target is going to be by the time the cast is done, unless you use it on a down or immobilized target. But for all you know, you can end up in the enemy group and just die for it. Sword 4, Shackling Wave, applies 12 stacks of vulnerability, also immobilizes the enemy. And lastly, Sword 5, Death Strike. It's a single target, large burst damage. It also applies Fury on you when you hit a target. Sword 5, you can actually use the Shadow Step even though you're not in range. You see the red line, that means I'm not in range, however, I can still use it. Like so. So while you're in Sword, just spam 1 as much as possible, as well as using your 2 and 4. Now I'll just quickly go over all of the stance abilities. So first off, we have Facet of Light, so I'm applying regeneration to me and my party. More importantly, the consume aspect of it converts all incoming damage into healing. Facet of Darkness, so this applies Fury for you and your party. I can't stress this enough, this is probably the most important facet out of all of these, since Fury is a large part of the Herald's damage. It is also a stun break, so if you ever get stunned while in Dragon Stance, be sure to use this. You can also use the active part of it while you're in your face smash. Facet of Elements, you're applying swiftness to you and your party. The active Elemental Blast actually does a lot of damage. Facet of Strength, apply Might to you and your allies, and the active does a large burst damage, and it also gives you a 7% damage increase for 5 seconds after you hit a target. And lastly, the Dragon Stance Elite Facet of Chaos, which applies protection to you and your allies. However, majority of the time you will be using this just for the super speed. Moving on to the dwarf skills, we have Soothing Stone, clears 5 condies and has a decent heal. Inspiring Reinforcement, also known as Rev Roads, grants your group stability, also does a lot of damage. So definitely use this as part of your damage rotation. Forced Engagement, this is your taunt skill. So it taunts enemies for 2 seconds and also reduces their outgoing damage by 33%. Vengeful Hammers grants you 13% damage increase while you have this active, and also gives you a 20% damage reduction. And be sure to use Vengeful Hammers whenever you face smash while in Dwarf. And lastly, the Dwarf Stance Elite skill, Ride of the Great Dwarf. Gain 50% damage reduction for you and your party, and it is also a stun break. Definitely use this if your group is about to take heavy damage. You can also use it if you're ever caught out of position so you can get back to tag safely. I'll end the video with some clips of fights that I've had recently, but before we get to that, just a quick recap of this entire video. Just remember to keep your facets going as much as possible while you're in Dragon Stance, especially Facet of Darkness, which is your Fury generator. Be sure to use Elemental Blast on cooldown as well, since it does a lot of damage, as well as Burst of Strength for that 7% damage increase. Also, switch stances as much as possible to keep your energy going. So as long as you have energy here, you'll be able to use your skills. Remember to use Hammer 2 and 3 a lot, and don't be afraid to bring Hammer into melee and use these skills there as well. Remember to use Rev Roads for not only the stability, but also the damage. A lot of the rev damage comes from the placement of your skills, so make sure you're actually hitting people with them. For the fights that I'm about to show, keep note of my skill rotation and my skill placement, as those are 2 very important things for this build. Thank you for watching if you made it this far. The Herald class is so much fun to play once you get the hang of it, and I really recommend it to anybody who plays this game mode. If you have any questions regarding the class, I would be happy to help down below in the comments or in Discord or even in game. And I'll finish this off with rolling the fights.